In this lesson, we're going to be discussing chapter 7 of the book of Hebrews. We could divide this chapter up into 5 different divisions. The first 10 verses records Christ coming after the priesthood of Melchizedek. Verses 11 through 19, we find that perfection comes through the Levitical, or rather perfection could not come through the Levitical priesthood. Then verses 20 through 22, we find that Christ was constituted by an oath, whereas the Levitical priesthood was not. Verses 23 and 24, we find there's many priests under the law, but only one under the gospel. And then finally, verses 26 through 28, priests had to first offer sacrifices for themselves. So these are 5 reasons why Christ's priesthood is superior to the Jewish priesthood. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this particular chapter. In the very beginning, we are introduced to the priesthood of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is said to be the king of Salem. King of Salem means king of peace. Many people think this refers to the city of Jerusalem, but that's really unimportant to the point of this passage. But Melchizedek is the first priest mentioned in the Bible. He is also said to be priest of the God Most High. This expression was commonly used in the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament scriptures, but it stressed the absolute superiority of God over the other gods of Canaan. It was not unusual in the ancient world for one person to be both king and priest. But of course, this was not possible under the Old Testament. Melchizedek's association with Abraham is found in Genesis chapter 14. We really know very little about Melchizedek. And that's the basis of this whole argument, is that once we knew anything about Melchizedek, then the argument would basically fall apart. But the point is that Abraham gave him tithes, which shows that Abraham recognized him as his superior. This is also the first mention of tithing in the Bible. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, which shows that he recognized he was superior to Abraham, and he gave God the glory for Abraham's victory. David refers to Melchizedek in Psalm 110, verse 1, and also in verse 4. Now remember, the writer of Hebrews here is not comparing Christ with Melchizedek. The writer of Hebrews is comparing the two priesthoods, not Christ and Melchizedek per se, but the priesthood of Christ compared with the priesthood of Melchizedek. Remember also that in the Old Testament, of course, no one could be both king and priest. Zechariah 6:13 tells us that the Messiah was going to be a priest sitting on his throne. Now, according to the law, of course, that was not possible. So rather than simply dismissing those biblical stipulations, the author finds a precedent for a non-Levitical priesthood. So he goes beyond the Levitical priesthood and compares the priesthood of Christ to that of Melchizedek. In verse 3, then, we find that Melchizedek is said to be without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. This sounds like he's eternal, but that's not the point. The point of it is not that he's eternal, or he never born, or that he was never died. It means he was without any written genealogy. In chapter 7, verse 6 indicates he did have a genealogy. In verse 6 he says, "But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithe from Abraham." There it points out it sounds like he did have a genealogy, but we just do not know what it is. And that's the point of this. Remember, for a person to be a Levitical priest, the lineage had to be known. You must know what your lineage was. If you did not know it, then you could not be a priest. It was not enough just to say, I think my father descended from this person, or I think my grandfather descended from. You had to know for sure. If there was any gaps in it, then of course you could not be a priest according to the law. And so here it simply means that Melchizedek then had no genealogy as far as the record is concerned. There is no written genealogy of Melchizedek. Philo once referred to Sarah as having no mother because her mother was not recorded. And that's the same that is true here. Melchizedek was made like the Son of God in that he is a priest forever. You see, he was not born, nor did he die. At least we have no record of that, which means then that his priesthood would continue. The importance of Melchizedek in this chapter is not of the eternal nature, but the point that he is both king and priest. The argument is based on the silence of the scriptures. If we could ever figure out who Melchizedek was and exactly who genealogy and everything, then the whole argument would fail. Notice also Melchizedek was made like the Son of God, not the other way around. We would think to be the other way around because after all, Christ was physically born long after Melchizedek. But Christ was here long before Melchizedek because Christ is eternal. Notice also Melchizedek only resembles Christ. It does not say Christ is identical to Melchizedek or vice versa. Do you see, many characteristics of Christ did not really belong to Melchizedek. What makes Melchizedek's order perpetual is that the scripture says nothing about the succession. Said nothing about the death of Melchizedek. Since he did not die according to the record, then his priesthood would continue. What makes Christ's priesthood perpetual is his own nature. The fulfillment is greater than the type. And so Melchizedek becomes a type of Christ's priesthood, but the antitype, the fulfillment, is always superior to that of the type. And then we come to verse 4. And it's talking about how great this man was compared to Abraham. And it said, even the great patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the tithes or spoils. Now this argument seems strange to us, but in the first century this would have made perfect sense. If Melchizedek could be shown to be superior to Abraham, then obviously it'd be easy to demonstrate the superiority of Christ to the Levitical priesthood. Here it said that Abraham was a prince of God to his neighbor. He's called the friend of God by God himself. To the Hebrew people, there was no one greater than Abraham. He was their founder. He was their father, so to speak. But even Abraham acknowledged the superiority of Melchizedek by paying him tithes. If Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, then his priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, must be superior to the priesthood that descended from Abraham. In verse 5 then, we find that Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek, and that the sons of Levi receive a tenth from the tithes or from the people of Israel. The dedication of a tenth of the spoils of war to a deity was practiced among many nations at that time. The law commanded the people to pay tithes to the children of Levi. In one sense, these priests were not superior to anyone because they were all brothers. They were all related. They all came from the same genealogy to some extent. They all descended from Abraham and his descendants. But the people of Levi received the tithes simply because God told them to. The law of Moses commanded the people to pay tithes to the children of Levi. But there was no law commanding Abraham to pay tithes to Melchizedek. It was given as a worshiper gives voluntary tribute to a superior deity or divinity. Therefore, Melchizedek was a solitary figure, and thus his greatness stands out. And so that's the point of this. Abraham volunteered to give tithes to Melchizedek, which shows that he realized Melchizedek was his superior. Not only that, but in verses 6 and 7, we find Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Now, since Melchizedek blesses Abraham, then that shows that Melchizedek recognized that he was superior to Abraham. The greater always blesses the lesser, not the other way around. So the word here carried the idea of an official announcement by an authorized person. Everyone understands that a blessing implies superiority of rank, age, or station. Since Abraham paid tithes and Melchizedek received them, then it's clear that Melchizedek is superior. A second point showing this in verse 8 is that the Levitical priesthood was inferior, because they are mortal. All the priests of the Levitical priesthood died, just like everyone else. But Melchizedek never died, or at least there's no record of him ever dying. The writer of Hebrews wants us to judge Melchizedek just as it is written. The writer of Hebrews is not saying Melchizedek lived forever, but only that there's no record of him dying. The Levitical priesthood was constantly changing, but Christ's priesthood never changes. And then we come to verses 9 and 10. And we find that here Abraham is called the father of Levi. Now, of course, that is not literally true. He was descended from Abraham, but there were several generations between Levi and Abraham. But that's what he's getting at when he says, so to speak. That little phrase, so to speak, indicates that the writer of Hebrews recognizes that Levi was not directly descended from Abraham, but it was indirectly. Levi was not born when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, obviously, so he did not literally pay tithes to Melchizedek. But when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, then indirectly all the descendants of Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek as well. And then we come to verse 11. He starts out with the word therefore. Remember what we said before, that every time you find the word therefore, then it means based on what's been said before, this is the application part of it. Therefore, if a perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there for another priest? Now the writer moves into proving why another priesthood was necessary. The Levitical priesthood was not perfect. We find that in chapter 7 and verse 19. It has a weakness to it. The Old Testament law was not designed to give the final complete relationship between man and God. The Jews considered the priesthood perfect since it came from God, and it was greater than all the priesthood that came before. But it was not perfect. But if it was perfect, then why would God say a greater priesthood would come? Remember in Psalm 110 and verse 4, we find the priesthood of Melchizedek is spoken of long after the law was given. So it shows again the superiority of Melchizedek and his priesthood. Now later, the writer of Hebrews goes into detail showing what the weakness or defect of the law of Moses was. But here he's just simply pointing out that it was weak in some sense. The Levitical priesthood was established under the Mosaic law in verse 12. Therefore, if the priesthood changes, the law must also be changed. As the priesthood was only temporary, so the law which governed the priesthood was also temporary. Yet the law speaks of the priesthood as being eternal, such as Exodus 40 and verse 15, and also Jeremiah 33 and verse 18. So in one sense, it said the priesthood is eternal, but of course it's not eternal because Jeremiah 31:31 makes it clear that God is going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And so the word eternal does not necessarily mean forever and forever in the sense that it's literally going to be eternal. It is never going to end. But it seems it's going to last until the age is ended. It'll be a long period of time, but not necessarily for all eternity. So the Jews recognized that Jesus also taught that the law would change. So the law is going to change. And then notice verse 13. Verse 12, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is a change of the law. And then verse 13, for he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe, of which no man has officiated at the altar. The reference here is to Christ. And obviously, Christ came from a tribe from which no one ever served as a priest. It was common knowledge that Jesus descended from the tribe of Judah. Judah was a royal tribe. It was not a priestly tribe. Remember, Levi was the tribe of the priest. So therefore, according to the law, Christ could not be a priest. That means then that in order for Christ to be a priest, the law must be changed. Moses gave no commandments regarding priests from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, no one from Judah could serve as a priest according to the law. Notice the argument from silence. Since Moses said nothing about the priest coming from Judah, then no one from Judah could serve as a priest. He did not have to say no one from the tribe of Judah could be a priest. All he had to say was that priests come from Levi. That ruled out every other tribe as far as the priesthood is concerned. Now, from our viewpoint, it would seem that God could just amend or alter the law to allow for a new priesthood. But that's not how God chose to do that. God chose to completely give a new law. And it also shows that God's silence on this subject does not give authority for doing it. Just because God does not tell us not to do something does not mean that we can do it. We must have a command from God or authority from God to do whatever we do in religion. Since there is no authority from God giving the priesthood coming from the tribe of Levi, from the Judah, then that means Christ could not be a priest. And then we come to verse 15, and here he gives an even stronger reason for changing the law. It was that Christ was to be a priest like or resembling Melchizedek, whose priesthood never ended. The prophecy foretold of another priesthood, Psalm 110 and verse 4. Therefore, it makes it evident that the law must change. Then we come to verse 16. Christ was not made a priest by a fleshly commandment. The Levitical priesthood was bound by earth-bound rules. It was marked by change. It also connotes weakness because it was all made up of human beings. But Christ's authority for the priesthood was because life and immortality were present in him, not by his descent from former priests. Christ was raised from the dead and is no longer subject to death, and he was exalted to the priesthood after his death. Now, since Christ was made a priest after his death, and after he died, he will no longer die again, then that means then that Christ's priesthood is going to last forever. And so in verse 17, we find a quotation from Psalm 110 and verse 4, where you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Here we find God himself testifying that Christ was to be a priest forever. Now, obviously, this was not true concerning the Levitical priesthood. Each priest under the Old Testament law died, but Christ is immortal. Since Christ's life never ends, that means his priesthood then would be permanent. It would never end as well. And then verse 18 gives us another reason why the law had to be changed. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment because of its weakness and unprofitableness. The word annulling is a legal term, which means a complete cancellation of the commandments. Since God gave the law, God also has the right to change the law or to alter it. The same word is used in Hebrews 9 in verse 26 in regards to Christ setting aside sin. The law was weak and unprofitable, that is, useless, not beneficial. It was weak in the sense it could not give men salvation. And that brings us to the next verse, verse 19, where it goes into detail specifying exactly what the weakness of the law really was. What was wrong with the law? Because the law made nothing perfect. It could not justify people who broke the law. It could not remove the guilt of sin. The only thing that could do that was Christ himself and his blood sacrifice. And through Christ, since our sins have been removed, we can now draw near to God. The word draw near means to come together to God in worship. The former priesthood kept men at a distance, but now we can come directly to the throne of God. Now let's look at verses 20 and 21. The Levitical priesthood received their office merely by regular descent. Now it was instituted at first by an oath from God or by a commandment. From there on out then, God gave no oath or gave no commandments concerning exactly who was going to be a priest or the high priest. On the other hand, Christ became a priest because of an oath from God, Psalm 110 and verse 4. This made his priesthood superior to that of the old. And then verse 22, by so much more, Jesus had become the surety of a better covenant. Since Christ was made priest by an oath from God, then that makes him a guarantee of a much better testament. The word for surety here occurs nowhere else in the New Testament, and it means one who pledges his name or his property to make sure that a certain thing will be done. In other words, Jesus guarantees us that God will honor his pledge to save man even though we violate the law of God. He is the perfect guarantee of the terms of the new covenant. This is the first time the word covenant is used in the book of Hebrews, but of course after this it's used many times, about 16 additional times. So it becomes a very important part to the rest of the book. Now, a covenant is not a mutual agreement between two parties, but is really simply an obligation undertaken by one person. You see, man cannot bargain with God. God lays down the terms, and it's up to us to simply accept those terms. Verse 23 gives us another reason why Christ is superior. Because under the Old Testament law, there were many priests compared to only one under Christ. Since the priests all died, their priesthood ended when they died. Therefore, there was a succession of priests. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says there was 83 high priests from Aaron to the very last one. There were 28 in the last 108 years even, because it had largely generated to a political office. So that shows the changing nature of the priesthood. But under Christ, There's only one. His priesthood is unchanging because he lives forever. It will not be passed to anyone else. The priestly ministry of the Messiah is what is concerned here. It's a ministry such that no other person can step into it. A ministry that cannot be transferred to another person. And then we come to verse 25. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and become higher than the heavens. Christ has the power to save us completely because of his unending life. He saves us from everything we need saving from. And he's able to save us because he is holy, he is harmless, he is undefiled. He lived a perfect life. Jesus continually makes intercession for us, that is, speaking on our behalf. This intercessory function of Christ is mentioned by Paul in Romans 8:34 and is also implied in Acts 7:7 and verse 56. But the very presence of God is a very effective intercession. And then verse 26. For such a high priest was fitting to us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled. This connects this verse with the preceding verse, and it gives the reason why Christ is able to intercede for us as he does. This verse contrasts the moral character of the priest. We need a priest, a high priest, who is personally holy. And of course, Christ fulfills that qualification and that need perfectly. This is quite different for the Old Testament priests, because all of them had problems. They were not blameless. They were not undefiled. They were not separate from sinners, because they were involved in sin just like everyone else. But Christ, on the other hand, is undefiled. He is holy. He was completely separate from sin. There was no need for him to offer any sacrifices before he offered sacrifice for everyone else. You see, verse 27 points out that the old high priest had to first offer sacrifices for his own sins every day, and then offer sacrifices for the people. The priest only offered a sin sacrifice once per year, but they did also offer daily sacrifices. In Christ, however, it was different. Christ was holy. Therefore, there's no need for him to offer sacrifices for himself. He offers sacrifice once for all. And this becomes very important, that Christ offered a one sacrifice for all time and for all people. Christ did not have to repeat his sacrifice, because one sacrifice was enough. This conveys the finality and the perfection of the offering of Jesus Christ. Under the old law, of course, men with infirmities and sin were made priests. That was the only possibility, because all human beings sinned. Priests were men just like everyone else, and so they had the same problems as everyone else. The oath, though, came after the law. The Son was made a priest by an oath from God. This came after the law was given. Therefore, it means the oath superseded the law and had the last word. By that oath, then, Jesus was made a high priest forever. And through this, then, we find that Jesus and his priesthood is far superior. Again, we find three reasons in the last part of this chapter for the superiority of Christ and his priesthood. Christ is superior because of the divine oath. Christ is superior because his priesthood is permanent. And Christ is superior because the character of Christ is far superior to that of the Old Testament. So that winds up this discussion of chapter 7, and we'll start chapter 8 in the next video. Thank you.